Welcome to Home Education Matters, the weekly podcast supporting you on your home education journey. Hello and welcome to another episode of Home Education Matters. And today I'm joined by Ossie, who was home educated all his life and has just graduated, and I hope I get this right, just graduated with a double first from Cambridge, an academic excellence scholarship, president of his college, and a training contract for a Magic Circle law firm. What did you do on your time off, Ossie?
I should start by saying thank you very much for having me on. It's very kind of you. I wouldn't hype me up that much. I don't think I'm necessarily offering anything that impressive. What did I do with my time off? I spent a lot of time reading. I did sports, did music, saw my friends, fairly standard stuff. I'd say most people of my age did. But yeah, also, doing home education, it's kind of difficult to have that boundary between studying and then recreational activity. So that was always something to navigate. But I'd say nothing particularly abnormal in my personal life and the kind of how I use my free time.
You weren't sort of 16 hours a day, nose to the grindstone, burning the candle down at night in your Cambridge college?
No, there is definitely a lot of work involved with studying at Oxbridge or, as with most universities, but not. I wouldn't say I ever reached 16 hours a day and definitely not by candlelight.
So today we're going to be talking about navigating that move from home education through to institutionalized learning, otherwise known as university. And obviously university is a very different kettle of fish to college, and college again is very different to school, and school is very different to primary, and it goes on and on. However, realistically, I know, Ossie, that you were home educated all the way through, and that then university must have been your first exposure to institutionalized learning. And so today I wanted to ask you a little bit about the ups and downs, what maybe came as a surprise to you, how home education maybe prepared you for it or didn't prepare you for sort of plummeting into institutionalized learning. And so that's what today's podcast is going to be about. So would you like to let us know, just before we start on that, a little bit about your home education journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I should probably start with a little bit of a minor correction, which is I actually did go to school until I was 12, and then started home education from year 8, I think, would be the correct year, and then up until university. So I did have some exposure to the institutionalized approach to learning before that. But to give a sort of overview, yeah, so I grew up in mostly in the UK, went to school until I was 12. Then when I was 12, had a sort of very complicated, difficult family disaster happen. And to kind of handle that, the sort of best option that emerged for myself and my younger brother, who was 2 years younger than me, my mum made the decision to pursue home education. I should clarify that my mum doesn't have any experience with teaching any kind of thing like that. She was educated herself, but and has no experience of the kind of difficulties of teaching a child. But yeah, we made that decision to do that and then just sort of plugged our way through until university, did GCSEs and A levels from home, with the latter sort of navigating through the pandemic as well. And then started at university in 2021 and have just graduated now, but I'm going back for a postgraduate master's in history for 1 year.
And I know that any of our listeners who are very good at putting pieces together might remember that we did a podcast with Emma White from Mark My Papers, who is Ossie's mother. And she was telling us about you as part of the podcast, because the podcast was about getting your home educated child, into one of the top tier universities. And there's no doubt that what came through for me from that podcast was how much effort and planning and time and preparation it took in order for that to happen from her perspective. What about from your perspective? How easy did it feel to go through the exam process at home, the GCSEs and the A levels? Obviously, COVID massively affected it.
Yeah, I should start by saying my mum is an absolute superstar and has been a brilliant sort of sidelines manager for me and my younger brother for a huge part of my education, although her influence obviously decreased after sort of GCSEs and things like that. In terms of examinations, it was definitely a sort of uncomfortable teething process. As I said, none of us had any kind of educational experience. My mum was not a teacher. So there's a lot of sort of trying to work out how to do this thing, what was needed, how to enter exams, how to find syllabuses and stuff like that. And in terms of sitting the exams themselves, we had to enter as private candidates at a school in, I believe, in Gloucestershire. Went in, sat all the exams, did my GCSEs over 2 years, so I did 4 in one go, and then did the other 5 in 2019. And yeah, overall, it was an interesting experience to do it. I remember turning up distinctly at the school where I was sitting, and everyone sort of looking at me weirdly, thinking, "Who's this random person that's turned up not in school uniform?" But yeah, I sat down, did my exams. It all was well, and then the same thing again the next year, and finished my GCSEs. And I'd say that overall, looking back over the process, it was the actual sitting the exams and everything was remarkably normal, but it was a sort of capping off of years of hard work and trying to sort of orienteer ourselves through how you do a syllabus and how you cover all the content from home. And I think the general takeaway I had from it was that for GCSEs especially, and I would say for A levels too, in the UK, a huge amount of resources are available online. The syllabuses are things you can find online. You can find a huge deal of the resources through things like YouTube and all kinds of stuff on the internet. And yeah, we managed to sort of making it happen with access to textbooks and things like that, and just sort of plugging away, because the sort of enduring philosophy was, even though my mum was not a teacher, she had gone through the system herself. It is aimed at teaching people the general qualifications to live and be employed in this country. How hard can it be? And that sort of prevailed through. And I think we very much adopted that philosophy as well at A level, that we had the skills to kind of take a sort of self-guided, autodidactic approach to education, and then use that at A levels too. But as you said, you brought up the pandemic, and the difference of sitting exams in those conditions was something interesting, because I remember actually I sat my A levels in 2021, but because I was doing them from home and we had to do these kind of examiner assessed grades, I remember the school I was sitting them at, I had to basically do a mock exam in every paper twice in February. So I ended up finishing my A levels like 4 months early, which was definitely a challenge and something, across the whole country, and everyone was facing really difficult times, especially in terms of things like healthcare, but also with regards to education. There was huge disruption. I had the sort of short end of the stick in that I had a sort of 4-month quick head start on having to do it. But the good side of that was that because I was home educated, I'd had so much leeway in being able to structure my time and structure my learning so that I could be prepared for that situation. And yeah, just as a kind of overview of the whole process, I think it was a really positive experience, and it prepared me very well for university, which we'll talk about in a bit. But yeah, I think fairly smooth overall.
I mean, I think it helps that your mum is a bit of a one-woman powerhouse. So
Yeah.
I certainly got that impression from the podcast, that she's a force to be reckoned with when it comes to planning, which I suspect helped a lot. But from your perspective, did you always want to go to Oxford or Cambridge, for example? Did you have a route or, a destination in mind?
It's a difficult question, and I think it's easy to kind of exceptionalize Oxbridge a little bit, to treat it as if it's some kind of very unique thing in education. But I'd always known I'd wanted to go to university. And I think when I did my GCSEs, I got the results I was very happy with, and I suddenly realized that I could sort of choose from any university I wanted at that point, because I'd got the results to do it. And then I began looking into universities and realized I really liked the course there at Cambridge, and I liked the college I ended up going to, and that was the sort of way of doing it. But I hadn't had this kind of vision of myself right from the start of my education, or even from the start of homeschooling, that I was like, right, this is the end goal. But I'd say after my GCSEs, that became something I was working towards. And my mum was very supportive throughout the whole process. She, as you say, she's very much a one-woman powerhouse. She knew exactly what to do, and the right sort of way to guide me. Although most of the work came from me, because it was me sitting the exams. She very much sort of steered me in the right direction at all times. And as you brought up, Mark My Papers, her company, which sort of was born out of this process of home education, became increasingly useful throughout the process, because it became a means for me to have feedback on work and to show that I could write essays to present to university. And I think without that, which is it's kind of weird symbiotic process that was born through home education, but also really helped my home education, her company and her were invaluable to the whole process.
How did you find applying to the universities and having the interviews, which I know there are multiple interviews for Cambridge, because don't you get interviewed for the college as well as the course, something like that? So how did you find that process when you were coming from a home education background?
I was quite scared, frankly. And I'm sure a lot of the people you've spoken to and a lot of the people who've come on the podcast, or of the almost 100,000 people across the country doing this, one of the things you get very often with home education is you say that you're doing it, and then someone sort of, turns their head a little bit and checks if they've heard you correctly and why you're doing it and what the reasons are, and are you sure it's the right thing? So I was very nervous about having that reaction when I applied, that they'd see my application and go, "What's this? Chuck it in the bin." But actually, they were extremely receptive, and I was very surprised when I got invited to interview. And you're correct, you have two interviews. So you have two for the college, and it's sort of, one is geared more at the subject, and the other is sort of geared more at seeing you as a general character. But both are sort of subject anchored, so they can tell your academic interests. And I had to also do a pre-interview assessment, which I did the morning of, I believe. And that was interesting because I had to do it virtually because of the pandemic. And I remember vividly trying to put the PDF file I'd completed in the Dropbox, and we did it with like 2 seconds to spare. And that was quite stressful. But overall, I think once I'd overcome that fear that they're not just going to throw my application in the bin, it all went quite swimmingly, and I felt very supported and very welcomed all the way through. And you've got to put this in the perspective of doing it during COVID, but it was all remote, and none of us had seen anyone in months, and it was all quite an anxious period anyway. But I really actually just enjoyed sitting and being able to talk with two sort of world-leading professionals in history about history, and to tell them a bit about my experience. And I think, although I was very nervous, obviously, I actually walked away from the process thinking that, even if I don't get accepted for this, I've had a nice time. I've been able to learn some things, have a chat with two people I'd never been able to interact with otherwise. And yeah, just have a sort of positive outlook on the whole experience.
Were you asked about home education in the interviews?
Yes. And the general feedback I give to anyone who's listening, that if you're home educated, the first thing in any interview is they'll bring up is the home education, because it sticks out like a sore thumb. But it's very much a thumbs up, if that makes sense. People look at it with intrigue, and provided you've been able to perform at the right level, people look at it with awe as well. So the first thing is always, we'll look at your application and we're astounded to see that you're home educated. Tell us a bit more about that. So I ended up talking in great detail about all the things we've been talking about today, and about how that sort of, made me fit well for a university environment, actually, which I think is one of the real selling points of making that transition from home education to university, is that so much of university is self-structured. You've got to create your own timetable and organize everything. You've got to find learning materials yourself. You've got to do extra reading yourself. You've got to prepare for lectures, all these things. It comes down to you in a way that I think caters more to home educated students than it does to school students, because there's a lot more independence involved. That's not to say the students in school are ill prepared for it at all. That's not what I'm saying. But home educated kids, I think, have a kind of familiarity with that process. So yeah, they obviously came up in the interview, and we talked a lot about that. And then they started grilling me on sort of everything else that they grill you on in a university admissions interview. But it was a kind of backbone to the whole application process that they kept on coming back to.
So it didn't feel like a hindrance to your interview. You didn't feel that they were sitting there thinking, okay, like what's going on under the surface here? It felt more that it was a chance for you to be able to say the positives of the experience and how that would guide you and be a benefit when you get to university.
I think, yeah, I don't think they perceived it as a hindrance. As I said, they're extremely accommodating, and I can only sing my praises to Christ, where I studied, to the maximum, really, because they were always extremely welcoming for me, and now for more home educated kids as well. Because I got GCSE results and an AS level result, they could see I wasn't, that I was serious about it, and because I'd done this pre-interview assessment, they could see that I was capable of doing, writing at that level. And I think, an interview in general is a means to sort of feel out what someone's like, how they communicate, how they think. And I believe that once I'd kind of demonstrated that a little bit, they sort of abandoned their skepticism. And it became exactly the same as any interview for anyone would become. So that was a very, positive thing to see, I think, because anyone who's thinking of applying to university from home will see that there's not really a huge amount of demonstrable support for home educated students. You don't see many pages on university websites saying, here's the page for home educated students. And I think it was nice to see that beneath all that, there was a degree of familiarity. Having said that, that is something that's changing. And one of the things I've been working really hard to change at Cambridge is to have more support. And a few of the colleges now do have websites and bios and things like that for home educated students, which I've had potential applicants come and talk to me and, say thank you for, because it's something that's really really supportive and really encouraging. But I think in general, the process was overall pretty good. The only kind of difficult thing I'd say about applying to university from home was the kind of the UCAS referencing process, which is something I'm hoping long term can be changed, but that you need two referees or one referee, I believe, actually for UCAS to support your application to university. And for a lot of people pursuing home education or from like doing it alone, like we were, there wasn't really anyone to do it with, so that was quite difficult to find someone who's legitimate to support us, who had a degree of knowledge about our experience. But hopefully that's something that can change, and that's even something that could change with how home educated students interact with their local authority and the local elective home education authority officer, whatever it's called, to just kind of provide that person to give that reference. But yeah, other than the reference, it was all very straightforward and smooth running.
Yeah, and I think one thing I've really noticed with the demographic in home education is that there were a lot of home educated children came in around about 2016-ish. Then there were a lot post-pandemic came. And there's no doubt that home educating through A levels, which used to be extraordinarily rare, like when you were doing it, it was very unusual. My son's literally just finished his A levels this year, and it was reasonably unusual when he started. But just in the last year or 2 years, there are more and more home educators coming through now who joined during COVID. Maybe they were 13, 14 during COVID, and now they're getting to the point where they're now at home doing A levels. So a lot of these will also go into the university system. So there will be more boots on the ground. And so that kind of representation that you were talking about is going to be increasingly important, but also increasingly available as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is something that's changing. I don't have the specific numbers to mind, but I know that across the UK now, I think last year there was something like 92,000 children registered in elective home education, and that fluctuates throughout the year, obviously. But the amount of people choosing this lifestyle choice since the pandemic has just exploded. I should clarify that, in my situation and in the situation of a lot of people, it's not a personal choice they make, willingly. It's the best option for them. There's loads of kids with disabilities or who are victims of bullying or have caring responsibilities or generally have to work around their parents' lifestyle choices, that this is the best option for them. And I think there's a growing awareness that that is the case, that people are choosing this out of very legitimate reasons, not just as a kind of rejection of the pre-existing system of education in the country. And I think that, experiences like mine and being able to talk to people about it, hopefully encourage people a little bit, that home educated people aren't ostracized. They aren't discouraged from entering into university or employment. They are just as welcome as anybody else. But as a result of that, they need to be held to the same standard as anybody else. We've got to still perform at the same level, which for a lot of us is very much achievable, and it's something we should aspire to. But it's fantastic to see that growing awareness and see that growing community building over the past few years.
Yeah, and one reason I wanted to do this podcast is because quite often when people choose to home educate or move into home education, they are hit with a certain amount of negativity from family or friends. And a lot of the time it's things like, well, what are they going to do? You're ruining their future. They're not going to have the same opportunities as everybody else. And I've actually been doing a series with home educated children, sharing the successes of home educated children in order to try to provide kind of almost data for these people to be able to come back and say, actually, no, there are still these very valid routes through higher education and the job market. So when you think about that shift that you made from being very autonomous, but with the structure that you put in place and earlier on when you were younger that your mum helped you put in place, when you think about that move from doing everything from home, which I know for a fact, 'cause my children are obviously doing it, is quite isolating in some way because you're out of the system. You don't have that support of the system. To then move into a university setting, you mentioned that autonomy and being able to organize your own workload was a huge benefit to you when you got to university. But what other things did you notice coming from a home education background?
I think I should preface this by saying that I did my A levels within the pandemic, so everyone was isolated for that period. I think the experience I'd had was quite similar to what a lot of people had had for the past 2 years. The thing that I think surprised me the most was how easily I adjusted and made friends. I was worried that I'd be sort of isolated and ostracized, or that even if I thought I was socially skilled in interacting with people, that I'd actually be sort of stunted from 6 years of being at home. But it was all really smooth, and everyone was very welcoming, and I felt sort of, people expressed curiosity about my background, but no one was dismissive of it at all. And aside from the educational stuff that we talked about, the actual academic transition, the social transition was absolutely wonderful because I was suddenly presented with all these opportunities to do things like I'd never even thought of, like trying ultimate frisbee or going to a quiz society or the United Nations Society, all these different things that I got to try that as much effort as you can to give those opportunities to a home educated child, you're never going to get to that level where you can offer so many choices of things to do. And I think that that was really quite wonderful to just suddenly emerge into that environment where I could, make friends, make contacts, try new things. And I don't think I was hindered by being home educated at all in that. I think one thing that possibly I felt from home education initially at the start of the university process, and I think this affects quite a lot of home educated kids, because being home educated is quite often for a lot of children, you spend a lot more time with adults than you do with other people your age. You don't have like an adult mind, or you're not super developed or anything. That would be ridiculous. But there's a kind of confidence in interacting with adults that I think a lot of people, when they start going to university or leaving sixth form, don't necessarily have. And I felt that because I was home educated, whether it was right or wrong, sometimes it was probably stupid, but I didn't feel scared of interacting with adults or teachers or lecturers or anyone running the college or whatever. It was nice to see that, honestly, because I felt that I had something that was nice. I could talk to people without feeling sort of shy or whatever. And I think that came from just years and years of not seeing as many people my own age as people in the school system would have seen.
I think there's a naturalness, isn't there, to
Mm.
being able to communicate with adults and having that. I've noticed it as well with my children as they get to their teens. They never had that kind of gawky, awkward stage with adults that teens have sometimes. And I think, like you say, it's just that a lot of your time is spent hanging around with your parents and with your friends of your parents and peers of your parents, maybe less so than with your own peers, or at least more so than a school child might discover. Did you find, I know you said that this social side was very seamless, but were you nervous going into college thinking that, okay, like how is this going to work for me as a home educated child?
Yeah, I was definitely nervous. I think everyone's nervous about starting university, and although I think you're right that home educated kids don't have the same gawky, awkward phase, I was definitely gawky and awkward. I probably still am gawky and awkward now. But I felt that there were things I was nervous about. I was nervous about having to sort of impress teachers and tutors more than other people did. I felt like I had more to prove, which sort of, it's an occupational hazard of, pursuing home education, that you've got to go that extra mile a little bit. I felt that although people were really welcoming and curious about my background, it got a bit tiring to explain it sometimes, because it's obviously changing now in the past few years. But at the time, there was a sort of perception of home education as something sort of, as I said at the start, a kind of rejection of the system we have in this country. When if I didn't go on to explain the very complicated circumstances that have pushed my family into making this decision, people sort of met it with a bit of skepticism as to why I'd done it in the first place. And although that was never an unpleasant experience, it sometimes got a bit tiring to have to explain it. So as I went through my university sort of life, I sort of began to explain it less and less. And I think that was just a natural part of it, because I was integrated into a new system, and your background matters less and less as you become part of a new community. But at the start, there was definitely sort of explaining to people and having the same reaction that anyone doing home education has, where people sort of look at you with curiosity and confusion. But yeah, overall, throughout the period, that changed. But those are the two main things I was nervous about, was the sort of academic proving myself and being able to perform at the right level, and then also the kind of explaining my background a little bit. And I think one of the other things that was interesting is there's so much dialogue in the university environment about the sort of split between state school and private school, which is a very valid split to make. And things like the 93% club, how universities do their admission statistics divided by that between state school and private school, although that's something that Cambridge now decided to abandon. It's very much a dialogue among students, and I was curious as to how I'd fit within that background, because I'm neither really. I didn't go to either of them, although I'd say I feel closer to being state educated because I haven't necessarily had the sort of private school, like sort of the things that come with that. I didn't really fit into either sort of camp. And I think that was a really good thing ultimately, because it means that you don't have this sort of petty tribalism that a lot of people have at university, where they're trying to sort of group themselves into a faction to, show that their background made them worthy of being there. But it also made it a little bit interesting when I was first there to try and understand where I sort of fitted in this grand landscape of backgrounds and educations.
That's interesting. When I went to university many years ago, it was all very mixed, and that was just before That was when it wasn't, you didn't so much have a grant, but you didn't have the tuition fees. And I wonder whether maybe the introduction of the tuition fees has made that dichotomy a little bit more sharp between the private school and the state educated pupils. Because I don't recall any of that when I was younger, but maybe I blacked it out of the the fuzziness of time. You mentioned there about one of the things you're nervous about was proving yourself, or worrying that you would feel that you had to prove yourself to the lecturers. I wonder how you felt when it came to the interactions with the lecturers, because obviously part of home education is that it's very flat when it comes to a hierarchy, right? There really isn't much of a hierarchy in home education. Even if you're reasonably structured and your mum's kind of organizing stuff, it's still very equitable, I think. When it comes to university, even though you're a fully grown adult and there is that sense of more of a sense of equality, there is still a hierarchy, isn't there? There's a lecturer, they tell you what to do, you're expected to do it on time. How did you feel when it came to that exertion of authority from the lecturers? Did that feel okay, or did that feel weird to you?
It's a good question. I didn't feel at any point that I rejected it or was made uncomfortable by it, because I'd been to school when I was quite young, so I was familiar with sort of being assigned work and having to have the kind of discipline that comes with a more institutionalized environment. I don't think there was any point that it sort of frustrated me. I think I only sort of found it a positive thing, because by the time you're getting to a degree level, there are things that you just can't necessarily work out on your own, and it's good to have someone there to do that. And I think if you're signing yourself up for a sort of academic learning experience, it's part of it that you're going to be challenged and people are going to push you. And I think, although it's the human response if someone's pushing you quite hard and saying, why is this the case? Go on, tell me more, tell me more. You're not really explained it very well. Go further. It's the human response to go, well, hang on a minute. That's not very nice. That's quite intense. But I think if you're in the mindset that you're here to learn and these people are the best equipped people to do it, then you can only sort of receive it positively. There were times when I first got there and it was like, oh yeah, actually, this is the person I can go to with questions, which was such a great feeling, because previously, if I'd been curious about something, I'd had to sit there and sort of, make my way through a pile of books or the internet or anything to try and find the answer. But to literally have someone I could just email and say, why is this the case? How do I do this? Was really helpful. So any kind of reticence there was to dealing with a newfound authority was actually coupled with a really positive experience of having someone who could guide me and support me and answer my questions and ultimately challenge me to learn more and understand things better and explain myself more coherently. So overall, I think it was a positive experience, but I can understand for some people that it would be a kind of teething process to get used to and familiarize yourself with, especially if you'd never been to school before. I think suddenly having someone who's sort of there to teach you is a big change. But I think the other thing to emphasize is that university in general is a very different environment to school. School, there is very much a sort of student teacher dichotomy that's existing there. And in university, while that's present, it's much more sort of blurred and in the background. You have a sort of relationship where you're very evidently learning from someone, but you're often sort of cooperating and working as equals, really. And it's a discursive environment rather than a sort of passive environment for the student. And I think that was something that home education prepared me quite well for and sort of softened the transition of moving to a more institutionalized environment.
What about when it came to the pace of the learning? Because obviously, for 6 years or whatever, you dictated the pace of your learning. You may have had GCSEs and knew the date of the exam, but you decided how quickly you learned, when you learned, whether you had like a few months off or a very busy period. You decided if you wanted a very intense period of study here and there. How did you find it when that pace of learning was dictated by the university? So this term we're doing this subject and this is the subject we're doing, kind of thing.
Yeah, it was definitely difficult. I would say that when I was home educating, I was working very hard, and there was a lot of kind of management that I had to put into my own work. I never sort of skived off doing stuff. I was trying my best all the way through. But I think there was definitely a transition there, and I can only really speak to the university I went to, and I don't want to sort of contribute to this idea of the exceptionalism of the university or whatever. But I know that Cambridge and Oxford have a reputation for giving you higher workloads. I should clarify that by saying that the teaching is not astronomically better or superior or whatever, which a lot of people think it is. And I don't think you'll have better education for going there in the same way a lot of people say you will. The one thing you will have is the workload, because they sort of pride themselves on the workload you handle. So it'd be things like writing multiple essays per week, having to read, hundreds and hundreds of pages just to write an essay, having to do research, having to meet other requirements and hit deadlines was definitely a transition. And I think had I gone to another university, that transition might have been a bit more easy, but Cambridge sort of prides itself on work for the sake of work. And, I benefited from that. It's made me capable of handling higher workloads, which is great going forward, but it was definitely a transition because I was suddenly met with a kind of cascade of things I had to do and reading lists and assignments and exam prep and all sorts of things like that. So it was definitely an increase, I'd say. And the expectation of how much you work was higher, which is honestly quite a toxic thing, I think, about Cambridge, which is the whole other discussion itself. There's a lot of toxic things about the university, although I'm, a big fan of it. That was one aspect of it that was quite difficult, was the workload. It's just this endless sort of conveyor belt of what you've got to do. And because the terms are only 8 weeks long, whereas a lot of universities have longer terms, it's really compressed into a shorter space. So you're sort of working around the clock to do things. But if you're passionate about the subject and passionate about, how you can use the skills you learned there and the knowledge you acquire there, I think the motivation sort of carries you through. And I think for myself, coming from home education, just as anyone from any background, that was something I sort of soaked up and tried to think of all the way through, that this is a positive experience and this is something a lot of people would really want. And I should make the most of it and try my best. And I think I did throughout the whole process, but it was definitely something to transition towards.
And you did history as a degree, right?
Yeah.
Now, so, I mean, my perception of history isn't that there's a huge amount of group work, but I'm assuming that there were points when you needed to collaborate with others. How did you find that process? Because I know, speaking from my own personal perspective, my son, who goes off to university next year, he has got very used to managing his own workload, sorting itself out, being responsible for his own outcomes. And I sometimes wonder how he will go about when it's a shared outcome and shared responsibility for a task. How did you find that kind of dynamic?
Well, it's not something I experienced a huge amount during my actual degree itself, the actual course I was doing, because the degree remained very independent. There are a lot of seminars and lectures and things and sort of discussion forums where we could talk and debate and things like that, which were very helpful. But there was never anything that was sort of a joint assignment. So I can't speak too much as the responsibility of having to work with other people on that. And I'm sure if I had done, there would be other people who are really dedicated and hardworking, and that would have been a really pleasant experience. So yeah, unfortunately, I can't really comment too much on that. But in a lot of the stuff I did in certain terms of student politics, there was a lot of collaboration involved. And I think that was a really, really new thing for me, actually, coming into it, because although it wasn't an educational thing, it was a more sort of extracurricular thing I was doing. Having to work on a student union and collaborate with other people on a committee all the time was something new, but something I really adjusted to, and a really important skill to have is that teamwork. And I think a lot of home educated kids miss out on that, because especially when you're expecting yourself to deliver to a certain standard, because you're very used to that and used to setting your own goals and your own aspirations in whatever work you're doing, expecting that from someone else can be quite frustrating, because the process of managing your whole education makes you think that you're in control of everything all the time, and suddenly not being in control of it makes it quite difficult. And that was a really important reality to contend with, I think, coming to university, that you can't do other people's work for them. It's about teamwork, and it's about motivating each other and supporting each other. And it was something I had to work towards, and I think I hopefully got better at it throughout the process of it. And I think it's something that I've missed out on during home education, but a really important skill that being at university taught me.
Are there any other things that you can think, looking back, that you missed out on being home educated that would have been very helpful going into university?
Oh, there's a lot of things I think I didn't necessarily got the same sort of activities and things people did at school. I often hear about friends who they'd say like, "Oh yeah, when I went on the school trip to Madagascar or whatever," and I'm like, "What?" Like the school trip, like when they go to New York and to Peru and all these sorts of things that sound really incredible and like great experiences. So I hear about things like that I'm like, "Oh, I wish I'd been able to do something like that." Um, but I think things that I felt I missed out on, I didn't feel like I was stunted as a result of being home educated. There were things that I've mentioned, like working in a team, like having to deal with a sort of more clear institutional authority above you that you suddenly have to contend with. but they weren't ever things that held me back. I think they were things I had to familiarize myself with, but ultimately skills I needed to learn. And I think if I hadn't gone to university, I wouldn't have encountered those skills in the same way. And they're important things to learn, even if they're not part of the course. Those sort of things are really important. And yeah, I don't try and look back at it with a sort of bitterness of, oh, I missed out on these things or I couldn't do these things. I see it as a really positive experience overall. And I think I look more at the positive things I got out of it. Like I managed to acquire a sort of, I got to spend loads of time with my family and my brother and my mother, who I'm very close to. I got to have a sort of freedom with learning that a lot of people don't have. I didn't have to deal with a lot of the troubles that come with school. The amount of kids who don't get the support they need for things like I mentioned, like disabilities, or kids who struggle with bullying from other students. They're things I was lucky because I got to swerve them. But equally, there's another side of that I missed out on a huge social part of growing up. So I think my main sort of takeaway is that you've got to view it positively and think of all the benefits you had in it, but see the things that you didn't have as things that you can sort of work on and grow from in future. And I think going to university sort of plugged a lot of the gaps there that I previously hadn't been able to fill, like having a social life that was more sort of embedded within my education, and like having to deal with things like teamwork and having to deal with sort of organized, institutionalized education around me.
When you think about any home educated children who might be listening, who maybe are going through their A levels or even thinking about moving to college and then moving on to university, are there any sort of pieces of advice you would give them, or any things you would kind of warnings, not so much warnings, but things to look out for, or maybe ways that they can prepare to make that jump?
I think there's loads of things I could say. I think the first thing is don't undersell yourself, and don't think that because you've had an unorthodox educational background that you aren't capable of entering into a mainstream system or achieving at the level that most people are expected to achieve out of. Home education has a huge amount of benefits for students, and those benefits are something that you can really take pride in. The unique approach to your education that you've had as a home educated student is something to be proud of. There's obviously gaps that we talked about that you kind of miss in the process, but they're things that you can fill. I think the other thing I would say is that, my advice in retrospect, I think, would be that try and have as much of a social life as you can before going to university. Try and make friends and try and sort of create as similar to similar to school sort of life as possible as you can. That wasn't grammatically coherent, but basically try and replicate a lot of the school environment by having a social life. And some of the best memories I have of home education are doing things like sport and tennis and music and having friends who I got to spend time with over those things. And I can see a situation that if you didn't actively do those things, if you didn't actively do extracurricular activities and have hobbies, you could very easily lose a lot of your social life, which would be a really big shame, frankly, because it's a big part of your education as well, is learning those social skills. And I think, I just, my main advice would be don't feel that you can't perform at the same level as everyone else. And when someone sort of reacts weirdly to you saying you're home educated, don't feel sort of ashamed of it. Just sort of take pride in the fact that you have the confidence and your family have the confidence to do something unique, that has a huge amount of rewards and benefits with it as well. Because education isn't something that has to rely on an institutionalized system. Although going to university, it's a real benefit of going to university that you get to benefit from this established system of institutionalization. It's not something you have to have education. For most of human history, the people who've been lucky enough to be educated have had it in a sort of home educated environment. That, schools are a relatively new thing, unless you're looking at the sort of ancient Chinese bureaucracy or whatever, but most people have had a sort of independent education, and it's something to take a huge amount of pride in. And I would hope that anyone considering it or anyone sort of struggling through it at the moment can retain that as their motivation, that they can do just as well as anybody else. And they're capable of achieving exactly what most people in society are capable of achieving.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Ossie. Why don't you let us know what your next steps are then? Because you graduated this summer and you're doing a master's in history. So what are your plans for the future?
Well, I've got to make my way through my master's first, which I'm very excited about. I'm doing a thesis essentially on connections between India and Iran in the late early modern period, and looking at how people in Iran sort of looked at India as a source of legitimacy and a source of status, which I think is a really important issue that we're dealing with at the moment, seeing how Iran is represented on the geopolitical stage and how the history of those relationships can sort of help us to handle those dynamics in future. So I'm really looking forward to a year of that. And then I am embarking on a PGDL, which is a postgraduate diploma in law, to convert to become a lawyer and qualify as a solicitor. And then hopefully do that for a few years before trying to work in some other sphere of the law internationally. I'm quite interested in international law, so I've been looking at those sort of opportunities as well. But as anyone in home education will tell you, you can't necessarily predict what road you'll go down. And we'll see, I suppose. All I can do is take each day and each month as it comes, but try my best with it.
That sounds a very interesting road to travel. I know that my son absolutely adores history and international politics and all of those kind of dynamics. And it's lovely. I think one of the loveliest things about home education is that quite often it is a generation of children who grow up extremely globally aware and very politically kind of switched on, and but also have that kind of, so many home educated children I know love history. They know everything about history. I think a lot of it is just they're given a lot of history books to read, like sit quietly and read this history book, and so you'll become like super experts in weird niche bits of history. But that sounds fabulous, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, Ossie. It certainly sounds like you got the absolutely best out of your university experience, and it seems that home education did not hold you back in any way, which is always reassuring for us and our listeners to hear.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's been really nice to talk about it, and I hope that anyone listening can sort of, if they're feeling insecure about being home educated or considering that don't feel insecure about it. Just have confidence in yourself that you're making the right decision. Throughout my education, was extremely doubtful about whether it would work out and how things would turn out. I'm still doubtful now, to be honest. But just have confidence in yourself that you're making the right decision, and that despite being unique in that way, that you'll be able to achieve something truly great through it.
Having the doubts and doing it anyway, right?
Exactly. The doubts are a big part of it, and ultimately they make you stronger.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Ossie. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Home Education Matters podcast. See you at the next one. Have a lovely day.